So it's time for our next class of biological molecule, which is the lipid. So again, these are the biological or macromolecules. We've got carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And we're looking now at the lipids. Lipids, if there's one word that you are going to remember for lipids, it should be hydrophobic. Hydrophobic means water-fearing. Now, of course, they're not afraid of water. They don't have emotions like that. However, lipids are going to stay away from water. And so because of that, they make great storage. If storage is what you do when you keep everything away from water, this is like they're locked away, they're sealed in a box, they're put in the attic, they're at a storage place, they're so far away, they're so locked, water can't even get to them, that you're very unlikely to metabolize them. That's why it's so hard to get rid of fat. Once you've gained fat, it's so hard to get rid of it because those lipids are stored away in your body. They also make great barriers. If you're going to protect your body, it's a great idea to do so with lipids. And so many animals will have like a slippery lipid kind of layer, like an oil. Okay, we make an oil also. And that oil helps create a barrier between them and the outside world. And the same is true as waxes. So on the very surface of leaves, you're often going to see waxes that are going to help prevent any water from leaking through into the interior structures. So even though a plant lives outside, it doesn't soak up water from its leaves. It brings up water from its roots, but only as it wants to and only as it needs to. It doesn't like swell up and then explode with how much water has come in. I mean, imagine what a terrible situation it would be if the first time you or I jumped into fresh water, we swelled up with water until we died. Okay, that would be a really bad situation for humanity. So it's important that these lipids help maintain the barriers of our body. As I mentioned, lipids are hydrophobic. Hydrophobic comes from the fact that they are non-polar. So there are two kinds of molecules in the world. We have to digress for a second. Are you with me? Okay. There are two kinds of molecules in the world. There are polar and there are non-polar. Okay. Polar things have charges or partial charges. Non-polar things have no charge. So what we see is that water is polar and lipids are non-polar. So this means that water cannot mix with something that is non-polar. Water, as we talked about with hydrogen bonds being like little magnets, right? This little kind of sticking together of those hydrogen bonds. Well, imagine that you're trying to stick a magnet to a piece of cloth or to a piece of plastic. Well, it's not going to stick, right? Water is like the magnet. But in this case, lipids are so non-polar that there's nothing for that magnet to stick to. So it just falls right to the ground. So there's no connection between things that are non-polar and water. So lipids are a non-polar, hydrophobic molecule. And their most famous thing, I think, that they do is that they form the cell membrane, which is called the phospholipid bilayer. And this is an outer protective layer of the cell. We're going to spend tons of time talking about this when we get to cells. Lipids can have phospholipids, and this makes the cell membrane. This cell membrane, because it repels water, keeps the boundary of a cell, which remember we said was one of the important fundamental characteristics of life, was that the cell could keep what was inside in and what was outside out. Well, the molecule that allows for that to happen, keep the inside in and the outside out, is the phospholipid. And the phospholipid is one phosphate head. This is a phosphorus head, and it has two lipid side chains. So it has two lipids attached to it. So each lipid is either saturated or unsaturated. So this is an important vocab to do with lipids. So saturated just means full, and unsaturated means not full. If you were to eat ice cream, okay, and you take the first bite and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Okay, I could eat ice cream forever. I could just eat this whole container of Talenti or this, whole thing of creamistry. I'm going at it, right? And you eat for a while. and you eat for a while. And then eventually you're like, I'm not sure if I still like this. I'm not sure if I'm still enjoying myself. Maybe you think I'm crazy for saying that. Maybe you're just thinking maybe I'm full. And if you keep eating and you keep eating and you keep eating, eventually you're going to reach a point where you cannot eat another bite, where you like think about taking another bite and you're like, ugh, gross. No, I don't want to eat it. Okay. That is saturated. You are saturated. Not a single another bite. No more. So when we look at these 3 side chains of lipids, this first one is saturated. That means that every carbon has the maximum number of hydrogens attached to it. No double bonds. If we look at this one in the middle, we have 1 double bond. So that would be called an unsaturated fat. And if we look at this one over here, this is a polyunsaturated fat. And now what we're really talking about is what you're eating. So when you consume saturated fats, fats like these ones, they can form a solid pretty easily. Even at pretty high temperatures, they can form a solid, like real butter when you get it out of the refrigerator, and it's so hard to get any butter and to spread it on your bread. It's like such a difficult thing to do because the butter is full of saturated fat. If instead you had an unsaturated buttery spread, which is what they call them, right? Like, I can't believe it's not butter or Brummelin brown. If you were to get something like that, you would notice that it melts really fast. Well, that also has a big implication in your body. If you eat these saturated fats, they very easily form plaque in your veins and arteries. Where if you use something like this that happens to be a liquid at room temperature, then it's not really going to coagulate in your veins and arteries, and it's not going to contribute to atherosclerosis or heart disease as much, which is why people recommend that you use olive oil or vegetable oil instead of lard, okay, which is an animal fat, because that animal fat is a saturated fat. So when you're choosing which fats you eat, one consideration is whether or not they're saturated. There are other considerations besides that, but that is one really important consideration, is that saturated fats tend to be a bigger contributor to atherosclerosis or heart disease. Kind of the quintessential, like, this is the fat, like this is the one that we see in the body, is called a triglyceride. So a triglyceride is a glycerol and 3 fatty acid tails. Phospholipids, now triglycerides, are both made from fatty acids. So if you want to know the monomer, of a fat, it is a fatty acid. The polymers of fat, and that's a little bit of a strange name, but that's okay, we'll still call them polymers, would be a phospholipid, this is one example, or a triglyceride. Triglyceride is just your plain old fat, like fat that makes this penguin blubbery, or the fat that's everywhere, right? Just your plain old animal fat is called a triglyceride. And it is 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. And they can be saturated or unsaturated. And remember, saturated means that it holds the maximum number of hydrogens, no double bonds. And unsaturated means that it has less than the maximum number of hydrogens, and it does have some double bonds. And remember that unsaturated fats are healthier for our hearts than saturated fats. Unsaturated fats are a liquid at room temperature. So you should be making some kind of guide for yourself that's going to separate the difference between saturated and unsaturated fat. The third class of biological molecules that we are going to look at in this class is the nucleic acid. The nucleic acid is what makes up our genetic material. They really have 2 jobs, nucleic acid. The 2 main jobs of the nucleic acid is genetics or energy. 2 pretty different jobs, actually, but they use the same biological molecule for both. We'll start with the monomer of nucleic acids. The monomer of a nucleic acid is the nucleotide. And so the nucleotide makes up all of your genetics and all of your energy. And so we're going to look at what is included in the monomer, the nucleotide. So there are 3 pieces, okay? The first piece is a nitrogen-containing base. You may have heard of these ones before. They can be A, T, G, or C, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. Any of those are fine. Then we have a sugar, a 5-carbon sugar. Okay, it's a pentagon, so you can see it's a 5-carbon sugar. And then they're attached to a phosphorus, a phos group. So this is like the plain basic idea of a nucleotide. If you're an energy nucleotide, you're going to add extra phosphates because the more phosphates you have, the more energy you have. So when we need energy, we use something called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. So the TP is a triphosphate. The more phosphates you have, the more energy you have. 3 is the max. So ATP, this would be an A, adenosine, A, TP, 3 phosphates. That's a really high energy molecule. We are going to spend an entire chapter of your life studying just ATP and how it's made, and that process is called cellular respiration. And I can't wait because I love concepts like cellular respiration. But until then, we're going to move on and we're going to look at the other role for nucleic acids, which is genetics. In genetics, we go back to our plain nucleotide, our nucleotide base, but this time we string them one after another after another. So we have adenine followed by guanine or thymine or cytosine, and we keep layering them down. And the order that they come in gives the instructions for who you are. It tells your body what proteins to make. Proteins are the last class of biological molecule, which we're gonna study next. So the recipe for making the protein is carried in the genetic structure, in the sequence of A's and T's and G's and C's. So for genetics, we have DNA and RNA, and they carry instruction in the sequence of the bases. The part of the nucleotide that really matters for energy is, so this is ATP, is the phosphate group. The phosphate group is the most important part of the structure when we're talking about energy. But the base sequence is what makes all the difference when it comes to genetics. So even though they use the same basic monomer structure of the nucleotide, 2 different nucleic acids can have vastly different roles in your body. They can do something like energy by concentrating on the phosphate, or they can hold your entire genetic code just by alternating A's and T's and G's and C's. So all of this genetics now wraps up and lends itself to the structure of the protein. And the protein is one of the busiest molecules we're going to find in the body.